As I had mentioned to you earlier in the week, I'm going to be on a short break for a few days. And I'd also said I might be tardy in recording Cut the Clutter episodes or writing and recording national interest. But you know what? Important news developments sometimes remind you that you have to keep working. At least you can't miss work when something as important as the anti-Agnipath protests are going on in the country. And you know my view on Agnipath or some kind of a major reform and downsizing of the armed forces. So we move from large manpower armed forces to high technology, high firepower armed forces, or improve our teeth to tail ratios. Now this was, as you had heard in the earlier episode of Cut the Clutter, this was something that I broadly endorsed. And now you have all these protests coming up. And the first rollback took place. That is when the maximum age for application was increased from 21 to 23. So why do these things happen? Why are these protests happening? What has gone wrong? What can be done? That's why I thought this was not a week when I could have missed national interest. So I woke up early in the morning and I wrote it. You can read it. I'll share a link with you. So here it is. You can also hear and watch what is it that I said in this week's national interest. And you know what? Once again, I'm back on fully DIY, do-it-yourself mode. I'm doing it all by myself. So please pardon me for any imperfections or any glitches. But I know that you are very forgiving with me. So what's happened today? And what is it that we are watching on our TV screens, newspapers, social media, everywhere? So the opposition to Modi's Agnipath scheme is being led by the articulate senior veterans of our armed forces on social media and in mainstream media, on TV channels and in editorial columns. It's also being led on the streets by India's dangerously burgeoning population of jobless youth. They are the ones who are coming out in the streets, particularly in rural areas, creating quite a bit of ruckus. Now, this is especially so in the Hindi heartland. Counterintuitive though it is, we have to also note that these young people understand the nub of the Agnipath problem as they see it much better than the much more senior, experienced, wiser veterans. And how do we say that? I will try and explain it. Now, most of the veterans are outraged because among many things they see wrong with Agnipath, they think the Modi government is using the armed forces for employment generation. They say, don't use armed forces for employment generation. We know elections are coming up in 2 years and there is a bad employment situation or unemployment situation in the country. But please leave the armed forces alone. Don't use us to generate jobs. We are not a job generating factory. We need people who are professional soldiers. That is among the many strong objections that the senior veterans community has. Now the young see Agnipath as exactly the opposite. The angry young you see, unfortunately, burning trains, buses, toll plazas, particularly in Bihar and some parts of eastern UP, they see Agnipath as the opposite. They see it as an armed forces jobs destroyer, not a job generator. How, we will explain now, and why. For the very reason they are primarily angry, the young are primarily angry. Those reasons make Agnipath a good scheme. We will explain as this week's argument unfolds. So please do stay with me. Now first, the jobless young. Where are they coming from? They understand better, not only because they know their politics better than venerable, well-meaning soldiers with decades in uniform. They've been in cantonments, line of control, or in operations, all exercising, preparing, teaching, learning. So they are protected from day-to-day politics. So these youngsters, particularly in the heartland, understand politics better. First, as I said, they understand this better because they come from the hyper-politicized and polarized heartland. Unlike the senior veterans who've spent their lifetimes in cantonments, they also know the hopelessness of the job market because they are in the job market and they know how little opportunity there is that's available. They see the absence of opportunity where they live and they feel their own lack of skills needed for jobs in distant, booming growth zones of India. That is in the south, in Gurgaon, in Noida, in Bangalore, in Hyderabad, Bombay, etc., etc. They find that they don't quite have the skills for those jobs that sunrise industry or the startups, tech industry, the jobs that industry is producing. They feel that they understand. They don't just feel, that's a reality. They know the reality that they don't have the skills to get those jobs. That's why a government appointment, whether in the railways, state government, police, central armed police forces, CRPF, BSF, etc., anywhere, is the only lifetime guarantee of a safe, well-paying job. The armed forces are by distance the best. They also have the best pensions, the best medical care even after retirement, etc., etc., and many other ex-servicemen's benefits even after you retire from service. Now, we must not judge these young people because they look like lumpen, burn trains and battle with police. They are every bit as virtuous and deserving of our understanding as the millions of the best educated who slog year after year, paying enormous sums financing the booming competition academy industry for those few UPSC jobs, just about 1,000 or a bit more. You can see how many young people across the country compete for those jobs and how expensive are the academies where they go to prepare for those jobs, for those competitions. For the less resourceful or educated, for mere matriculates, an army recruitment rally means the same thing as the big UPSC for those whose pictures you see in your full front page advertisements in newspapers and leading dailies from Unacademy, Byju's, Vision IAS, etc., Rao Study Circle. I think that also I see often. Academies like that, they prepare just as assiduously for army recruitment. How assiduously? Jyoti Yadav, our young colleague at ThePrint, brought the story in a ground report from the Hindi heartland. I'll share a link with you. Please read that story. Now, the less privileged see Agnipath as their own version of UPSC being taken away. See it this way. Presume that UPSC exams weren't held for 2 years because of COVID, just as recruitment rallies did not take place for 2 years because of COVID. Now you announced the recruitment for India services will only be for 4 years, not a lifetime job, only for 4 years, and only 1/4 of those who join will get the full tenure. Further, for like-to-like comparison, suppose you also set a new lower maximum age limit to ensure our civil services remain youthful, and tough luck for those who grew too old in the past 2 years waiting and preparing. By the way, this is precisely why the government has now made its first rollback and given this one-time maximum age exemption or relaxation from 21 years to 23 years, because for 2 years now they've realized, belatedly, they should have done it earlier, they've now realized that these young people mostly in rural India have been preparing for Fauji Bharti or army recruitment for 2 years. They've grown older by 2 years, and suddenly you say maximum age is 21. So a lot of these people who've been preparing are now wasted. They see themselves as wasted. That's why this one-time 2-year relaxation has been given. Now, if you disrupted UPSC, as I am explaining, just as you've disrupted armed forces recruitment, much bigger riots might break out in the same zones of the heartland. And you know what? Our middle, upper middle class, elite public opinion will be entirely sympathetic to them, even more than they might have been to the anti-Mandal protests and self-immolations in 1990s. The debates on prime time and social media are what passes off for debates. The debates on prime time and social media, which Modi government, by the way, takes much more seriously than people like us. They don't take people like us so seriously, Modi government. They take social media, particularly Twitter, a lot more seriously. These debates would sound very different from what they do at this point, because a lot of the middle class, upper middle class elites will then see this IAS, etc. aspirants as more like their own, more like people like us, smart people, unlike these rural young people who are fighting for a few army jobs. Now, I'm not supporting the ongoing Agnipath protests or dismissing concerns over these as mindlessly elitist. So be careful. These are a distressing, dangerous alarm for India, that our demographic dividend is becoming a wasteful disaster with crores of unemployed young seeing a government job as the holy grail. That's the most disturbing thing, because no government can produce this many jobs. It's unreasonable to expect that government will employ all of India's or even a fraction of India's unemployed. There's far too many people and government is much too broke. And certainly no government can produce this many jobs in the armed forces whose balance sheets and budgets are already an HR disaster. However flawed Agnipath might be yet, our armed forces need radical reform. But we need to understand these angry young people's concerns. Now, senior veterans erred instinctively into seeing this as a job-creating extravaganza, exploiting the armed forces. It's the opposite. Since India hasn't held any recruitment rallies for the past 2 years, a shortfall backlog of 1.3 lakhs has built up in our armed forces. If the total armed forces are about 13 to 14 lakhs, that means a shortfall of about 10% on existing strengths has built up already. Here is the math. Since only about 40,000 Agniveers will be recruited every year, in the first year maybe 46,000, this compares to the usual 60,000 at full 10-year recruitment rallies. So instead of 60,000, you're recruiting 45,000. So that itself is a cut. Second, only 1/4 will be retained after 4 years. Once again, you can do the math over 4 years. So you can say generally that if 40,000 are recruited every year in the Agniveer scheme, in 4 years, only 40,000 will be retained in permanent service or tenured service in the armed forces. Compare that to 60,000 being recruited every year right now. The most elementary calculation shows that at the current rate of about 60,000 retirements each year, by 2030 the armed forces will field about 25% fewer people than they did before the COVID break. So your armed forces will be about 1/4 less in manpower, which is actually a good thing, because you could then divert the same money to better weaponry, better technologies, better electronics, etc., etc., better logistics. That's also very important. This will be a deliberate, substantive downsizing and a desirable outcome, fully in tune with the global trend. The US military heavily cut its manpower and is reducing further. In fact, US Marine Corps has now said they will be buying no more tanks. They will be working more on artificial intelligence and standoff weapons, etc., etc. So US is reducing even further after having cut down. They are diverting dollars to standoff weapons and artificial intelligence. Chinese PLA has been similarly downsizing. Agnipath can be fine-tuned also, reinvented, renamed if the government so wishes, and relaunched. But something like this is needed. Contrary to being a wasteful job-generating extravaganza, in my view, a tour of duty approach is to cut jobs, wages, and pensions. This is not creating additional jobs. This is actually reducing the jobs. I explained to you why this is a good thing. But for the job seekers, it doesn't seem like that, because they want the jobs. They don't want jobs cut. The same money, however, can go into drones, missiles, long-range artillery, and electronics, and minimizing casualties in the battles of the future. Even proper assault rifles are short right now with our armed forces, because our armed forces are so resource-starved at this point. As respected former Army Commander Lieutenant General H.S. Panag pointed out in this article, you will see the front page of the article, the top page on my screen, but you can read the whole article in the link that I am giving. An idea like Agnipath is well-intended, necessary, and could do with improvements. But it is yet another rude reminder to Modi government that however overwhelming electoral popularity doesn't empower them to enforce shock and awe change. Boom. No matter how virtuous. They've seen it with the now repealed farm laws, because they never explained to anybody, they never reasoned, they never went through a parliamentary debate and process. Immediately, farmers suspected this and protest built up, and they had to withdraw these. They've seen it also in the stalled new labor codes, which again I think were very reformist and a good idea, and they also withdrew the land acquisition bill similarly. A big change in a democracy has to be reasoned out, public opinion prepared, people respond to, abrupt change in their hundreds of millions. They have anonymity and safety in numbers, unlike the few hundred fawning MPs of the ruling party, a few scores of ministers, and maybe a dozen or so ruling party or ruling alliance chief ministers in the country. Now, whether it's land acquisition or job creating industry and infrastructure, labor and farm reform, to unleash new forces of entrepreneurship, or to modernize the armed forces, you have to evangelize your ideas to people patiently. Allow a robust debate in public and parliament instead of dismissing anybody disagreeing as anti-national or bought out by some evil force. It's an ordinary, normal and inevitable exercise in a democracy. The same democracy that gives you this extraordinary electoral power as the Modi government has got for the second time now. Finally, we need to look at the geography and politics, or shall we be cheeky and call it the geopolitics of these protests. Let's look at the geography first. If you map the nearly 45 or maybe by now 50 places where protests have broken out, there will be a hornet's nest of sorts in Bihar, Eastern UP, Bundelkhand, Southern Haryana and Rajasthan. We can safely classify as India's primary low-wage migrant labor exporting zones. Check out, for example, where the mostly poorly paid security guards doing daily double shifts in your neighborhood come from. They'll mostly come from these areas. In fact, a lot of them would come from Bihar, Eastern UP and Bundelkhand, the poorest zones in the country. At least so far, this spark mostly hasn't traveled to south, barring the Sikandrabad, Hyderabad region, where unfortunately one young person was also shot dead in a police firing. Let's hope and pray it stays that way. Unlike the heartland, the south of the Vindhyas have their birth rates, education levels, investment and job creation much more sorted. Not perfect, but much more sorted. It doesn't mean that Indians there are any less patriotic or they love the armed forces any less. They just have a larger menu to choose from. And now the politics. With farm protests, the epicenter was Punjab. Punjab is the state least impressed with the Modi phenomenon or the Modi magic, as we have explained several times before, and as every election in Punjab since 2014 has already shown us. This current anger on Agnipath comes almost entirely from BJP NDA run states, from the very core of the Modi BJP base. It's safe to presume that a vast majority of these angry young people are loyal Modi voters. So this is a rebellion by the faithful, and that's what makes it different from farm protests. The lesson is there is more to democracy than electoral popularity. Just because people vote for you, they will not accept anything you ask them to do unless you reason with them and explain to them. You need to keep reasoning with your constituents and voters all the time, especially on why some drastic change they fear might be good for them. People have an immune system that detests and fears sudden change plonked on their heads. They need you to explain to them, particularly if you are a leader who they adore and who they voted for. They don't want to be surprised by you like this, particularly when it seems to affect their own interests. Modi government's biggest flaw over these 8 years has been its disinclination to accept the limits of electoral majorities. Just because you get a majority, it doesn't mean you can do anything. In a democracy, you still have to reason, persuade, sell your ideas. This arrogance that comes from electoral majorities has already ruined Modi government's land acquisition bill and farm reform, major farm reform. It has stalled labor codes, and it will be tragic if armed forces downsizing and modernizing is derailed too, because this is very, very, very vital if India has to build armed forces for 21st century challenges. As we have seen already in Ukraine, in the Russia-Ukraine war, it is technology, it is standoff weapons, it's the distance from which you can fire, it's who sees the enemy first who wins. It's not just the number of troops or the number of tanks. If that was the case, Russia would have taken over Kyiv in the first 7 days of the war.